There is a coin in my left pocket. I have carried it for 24 years, through paramedic training, through 100 night shifts, through more emergencies than I can count. It goes in my pocket before every single call, same as my keys, same as my radio. Most days I don't even think about it. But some days, usually the quiet ones, the ones where I'm sitting in the cab of the ambulance with cold coffee and nothing on the scanner, my hand finds it on its own. One side is smooth, the other is rough. An insignia worn down by decades of handling before it ever reached me. I don't take it out on those days. I just hold it through the fabric and remember. I was 8 years old. I had no shoes on. And I had no idea that what I did in the next 40 minutes would bring 2,000 motorcycles into our little town before the sun went down. Stay with me on this one. Crestfall, Oregon. If you blinked driving through it, you missed it. Population somewhere around 800 depending on the season, and whether the Hendersons were counting their cousins from Bend as residents again. One gas station, one diner, one general store that smelled like pine resin and motor oil no matter how many times Nora Marsh mopped the floors. A post office the size of a garden shed. A water tower that had been rusting since 1987. And a volunteer fire department whose engine spent more time parked outside the Legion Hall than it did fighting anything. The town sat at the end of a two-lane highway that turned into a state road, that turned into a county road, that turned into a gravel road that basically gave up about a half-mile before it reached our front porch. Beyond that, there was nothing but Douglas fir trees and elevation, and the kind of silence that people from cities pay a lot of money to visit for a weekend and then can't handle by Sunday afternoon. We didn't have money for vacations. We had the forest. And for me, that was enough. My name is Ellie Marsh. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house at the end of that gravel road with my father Decker, my mother Nora, and a dog named Pepper, who was part beagle and part something nobody could identify but who had opinions about everything and communicated them loudly. My father ran a one-bay mechanic shop behind the house. He worked mostly on trucks and old farm equipment, the kind of work where your hands are never fully clean and your back hurts before noon. My mother stocked shelves at the general store in town 3 days a week and spent the other 4 keeping the house from gradually returning to the forest that surrounded it on 3 sides. We weren't poor in the way that word gets used in movies. There was always food. The heat worked most of the time. Christmas happened, but there wasn't extra. There wasn't padding. If the truck needed a new alternator, you didn't eat out that month. If the roof started leaking, you delayed getting new boots until spring. You learned to be careful with things, and you learned not to ask for things you didn't need, and you learned that the distance between fine and not fine was shorter than most people wanted to admit. My father was a quiet man, not cold, just quiet, the kind of man who showed love through action rather than language. He would drive 45 minutes in the dark to pick you up from a school event without being asked and never say a word about it. He would fix things without being told they were broken. He watched the world carefully and said very little about what he saw. When he did speak, people listened because they had learned by then that he didn't waste words. My mother was the opposite. Nora Marsh filled a room the moment she walked into it, not with noise exactly, but with presence. She was the one who knew everyone's name in Crestfall and remembered their birthdays and showed up with food when someone's parent died. She was warm in the way that makes people want to stand close to you, the way that makes children trust you immediately. She had a laugh that started in her stomach and didn't apologize for itself. They were a good match. She talked, he listened, she moved, he steadied. Between the two of them, they raised me, and somehow I turned out to be a quiet child who moved quickly when it mattered, which is a combination that doesn't make a lot of sense until you realize I was just watching both of them at once. Here is what my teacher said about me every year without fail. Pleasant. That was the word. Mrs. Hale, who taught 3rd grade and had been teaching 3rd grade since what felt like the founding of Oregon, wrote it on every progress report like she was reading from a template. pleasant, well-behaved, works quietly, could participate more. I sat in the back of the classroom. I drew birds in the margins of my worksheets. I watched things. I was not the kid who raised her hand first, or the kid who got picked first for teams, or the kid who anyone would have looked at and said, "Watch that one, she's going somewhere." I was pleasant. My mother once asked me why I didn't play with the other kids at recess. I was 6 years old, and I thought about it seriously before I answered. I told her I liked watching the crows more. They were doing interesting things, and the kids were just running around. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read, and then said, "Okay, sweetheart," and that was that. I had Pepper, and I had a bike with a bent rim that made a rhythmic clicking sound when I rode it. And I had approximately 4 square miles of pine forest that I treated as my personal kingdom. I knew every trail in those woods by feel. I knew where the deer came down to drink in the early morning, and which fallen tree had a hollow underneath it, where something small was living, and where the ridge broke open and you could see all the way down to the valley floor on a clear day. I knew the marker rock, a granite boulder, about the size of a washing machine, that sat at the top of the main trail, and I had made myself a rule that I didn't go past it alone. The forest beyond that point was different, older. The trees were bigger, the light was thinner, the trails got uncertain. It felt like a different place entirely, and I respected that the way you respect a fence, even when there is no sign on it. I had been keeping that rule for 2 years. I broke it the morning everything changed. It was the last Saturday of October. The air had that particular cold to it that October mornings in Oregon have, the kind that gets into your lungs when you breathe and makes you feel awake whether you want to be or not. The sky was pale gray through my bedroom window when I got up. My parents were still asleep. I pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt and my sneakers and took Pepper out the back door without turning on any lights. Pepper went straight to the tree line and disappeared, which was normal. I walked out into the yard and stood there for a minute listening. The forest in the morning makes a specific kind of sound. Wind in the high branches somewhere above where you can see. Occasionally a woodpecker working at something distant. The low conversation of birds deciding whether the day was worth engaging with yet. That morning, I heard something else. A dog barking, not Pepper. This sound was coming from somewhere past the ridge, higher pitched, more urgent than the way Pepper barked at squirrels or at the sound of Decker's truck coming up the road. This was the bark of an animal in distress. The kind of bark that has a particular texture to it. A rawness like the animal has been at it for a while and is starting to lose hope that anyone is going to come. I stood in the yard and listened. Pepper came back out of the tree line and sat next to my left foot and tilted her head at the ridge and then looked up at me. She heard it too. I told myself I would just go to the marker rock and listen from there. That was still within my rule. I could go to the marker rock and figure out if the sound was getting closer or going away, and then make a decision. I got to the marker rock in about 12 minutes. The barking was louder from up there, coming from the far side of the ridge and below it down the western slope into the old-growth section I had never been into alone. I stood on top of the marker rock and looked in that direction. I could see the tree line thickening about 100 yards further on. The light was different in there. The trees were close enough together that they held the dark longer. Pepper pressed against my leg. The barking stopped. In the sudden absence of it, I heard something else. A low grinding sound, steady and rhythmic. Metal against wood, the sound of something being worked at the sound of something under tension. It was faint, but it was there, and it was coming from the same direction the barking had been coming from. I got off the marker rock and kept walking. I went past the ridge and down the western slope through the old growth and into a clearing I had never seen before. The Douglas fir at the center of it was enormous, 6 feet across at the base, maybe more. The kind of tree that had been standing there since before anyone in Crestfall was born, since before the town existed, since before most of the things that felt permanent and fixed to a child of 8 had been thought of by anyone. Its bark was deeply furrowed reddish-brown, and it smelled like something between earth and rain and time. There were 4 men chained to it. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, and I looked at them, and I processed what I was seeing. My brain did this thing it sometimes did where it went very quiet and very clear, and just took in information without reacting to it yet. I noticed details the way you notice things in a dream, one at a time, each one landing and settling before the next arrived. The chains were not handcuffs. They were logging chains, the industrial kind, thick links of steel used to drag timber through rough terrain. Someone had wrapped them around the trunk twice and then looped them through each man's wrists behind their backs. And there was a padlock on each set, heavy and black and completely closed. These chains were not improvised. Someone had come to this clearing with the specific intention of doing exactly this. The men were in bad shape. They wore leather vests torn in places. The patches I could see from where I stood were dark with what looked like dried mud but wasn't. Their boots were gone. Their faces were swollen, some of them dramatically, so the kind of swelling that changes the geography of a face, so that the person wearing it looks like a different person than they usually are. One man had blood-dried brown down both sides of his face from somewhere above his ears. Another had a hand that bent at an angle. Hands were not meant to bend at, and even from 20 feet away, I could tell that the shape of it was wrong in a permanent way. The man on the ground to my far left had not moved since I entered the clearing. His chest was rising and falling. I could see that, but barely, and the color of his skin was wrong. It had gone a gray-blue that I had never seen on a living person before, and I understood without being able to name what I was understanding, that the color meant something serious. The biggest man was directly in front of me, maybe 10 feet away. His head was shaved, and there was a tattoo running from his jawline down past the collar of his torn vest. One eye was swollen completely shut. Dried blood had tracked down from his eyebrow across his cheek into his beard. He had the kind of physical presence that made a space feel smaller when he occupied it, even now, even reduced to this. His right eye was open. It found me standing at the edge of the clearing, and it stayed on me. And then he spoke. 2 words barely above a whisper. The voice rough and scraped, raw and coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Help us. My whole body wanted to run, not in a way I'm ashamed of, in a completely reasonable way. Every warning my parents had ever given me was firing at once the hard-wired instructions that children absorb over years, and that exist for good reasons. Don't talk to strangers. Don't go past the ridge. Don't get involved in things you don't understand. These men were strangers. I had gone past the ridge, and I did not understand any of what I was looking at. But I didn't run. I am not going to tell you it was bravery. I have thought about it a lot over 24 years, and I still don't think it was bravery. It was something more like the thing my father had described to my mother years later. The thing that was either a compliment or a warning depending on how you looked at it. My brain didn't generate the option of running and standing still at the same time. It generated the option of running or the option of moving toward the problem. And the problem was in front of me, and moving toward it was what happened. I stepped into the clearing. "Are you hurt bad?" I said. The big man almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way to a smile because of what his face was currently dealing with, but you could see the intention of it. The sound that came out was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Yeah, kid," he said, "we are hurt bad." I looked at the chains. I thought about what I knew about chains and locks. I said, "I can try to get the chain off." "You can't," he said. "It's padlocked. You need bolt cutters or a key." His voice was rough and strained, like speaking was an effort that cost something each time he did it. But his eyes stayed focused on me, clear, present. "Do you have a phone?" he said. I shook my head. "There is no signal out here anyway," I said. "I need to go get somebody with tools." He nodded, one small, careful nod, like even that motion had a price. "Then go," he said. "Run if you can." I looked at the other men. Curtis Fane had his head tilted back against the bark, mouth open, breathing in shallow, uneven pulls like each one required a decision. Lee Darrow was watching me with clear eyes, but had said nothing. Just watching. And the man on the far left, the grey-blue one, the one whose chest was barely moving at all. I asked who did this. The big man shook his head. Doesn't matter right now. I asked if those people were coming back. He looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I understood the pause was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man deciding how much truth to give an 8-year-old in a situation that called for a lot of it. They said they were, he told me. Everything shifted. I wasn't looking at 4 hurt men anymore. I was standing in the middle of something that was still happening. Something that was not finished. Something that had a next chapter, and the next chapter was coming here. The clearing wasn't just a place where something bad had occurred. It was a place where something bad was going to come back. Go, the man said. Now. I turned and I ran. I ran harder than I had ever run in my life. Back up the western slope through the old growth past the marker rock, down the main trail toward the back of our property, and through it without stopping at the house. 2 miles. That was the distance between the clearing and the nearest house with a landline, which was the Gruber property. And I knew it the way I knew all the distances in those woods by feel and by memory, and by the number of times I had walked it. Branches hit my arms and face. Rocks came up through the thin soles of my sneakers. I don't remember feeling any of it. What I remember is the rhythm of my own breathing, and the sound of my feet hitting the trail, and the thought that kept cycling through my head, not a sentence exactly, more like a feeling with direction. Faster, faster, don't stop. I came out of the tree line into Virgil Gruber's backyard at a dead run and hit a garden hose I couldn't see in the frost, and went down face first in the frozen grass. Virgil Gruber was 72 years old. He had lived in Crestfall his entire life, and he had seen most of what this part of Oregon had to offer by way of unexpected events. He came out onto his back porch with a shotgun in his right hand and a mug of coffee in his left, and looked down at the small figure sprawled in his yard. When he saw who it was, he set the shotgun against the porch railing. "Ellie Marsh," he said. "What in God's name?" I was still on my knees, still getting my breath. I looked up at him and pushed the words out in whatever order they came. 4 men, chained to a tree past the ridge. They are bleeding bad. One of them isn't moving right. Someone did it to them, and they said they are coming back. Virgil didn't ask questions. He didn't stand there sorting through whether to believe me or not. He had known me since I was born, and he was the kind of man who understood that some things required action before they required understanding. He went inside and called 911. He gave them the general location, the western slope past the ridge behind the Marsh property, and he told them it was serious and to send medical. Then he came back out and looked at me. "What were they wearing?" he said. "Leather vests with patches," I told him, "like the men who ride through town sometimes." Something moved behind Virgil's eyes. It was quick and it was controlled. But I saw it because I watched things and I was standing close. He went back inside. I heard him dial a second number. The conversation was short. His voice was too low for me to make out the words. When he came back out, he looked the way people look when they have just added up a sum they were not expecting. "I called someone who knows about those kinds of people," he said. "Someone in town." I asked if the men in the chains were bad people. Virgil looked at me for a long time. "Right now, Ellie," he said, "they are just men who need help." He loaded bolt cutters into the bed of his truck. Water. A first aid kit. 2 wool blankets. I climbed into the passenger seat without being asked, and he didn't tell me to get out. We drove the logging road as far as the logging road could be driven, which was not very far, and then we got out and hiked the rest. Virgil carried the bolt cutters and the first aid kit. I carried one of the blankets. We went up the main trail and past the marker rock, and down the western slope and into the clearing. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The big man's one open eye found me the moment I stepped into the clearing again. Something in his face changed. Relief, maybe. Or something more complicated than relief, the expression of a man who had been calculating odds and revising them downward for hours. and had just watched the odds go up. Virgil set down the kit and looked at the situation for a few seconds. Then he got to work. He cut them free one at a time, starting with the man furthest left, the grey-blue one, and worked his way around. The bolt cutters took real effort on the heavy links, Virgil's whole body behind each cut. But he was stronger than he looked for a man his age, the kind of strength that comes from a lifetime of working with your hands, rather than the kind that comes from a gym. The big man's name, I would learn in the next few minutes, was Marcus Boone. He stood up on legs that shook visibly and put one hand against the tree trunk he had been chained to and just breathed for a moment. His wrists were raw down to the muscle in places. He tried to make his hands work and couldn't at first. He stood there with his back against the tree opening and closing his fists, slowly trying to get the blood to remember what it was supposed to be doing. Curtis Fane stood with help and stayed standing barely. Lee Darrow got up on his own and moved to the edge of the clearing and stood with his arms crossed and looked out at the trees and said nothing. The man on the far left was Danny Veal. When Virgil got to him, Danny couldn't grip the water bottle. His hands had stopped cooperating entirely. His skin was still that wrong color gray at the edges, and when Virgil helped him sit upright against the tree and tipped water into his mouth, Danny coughed half of it back up, and the rest went down wrong, and he coughed again. Virgil held the bottle like you would hold a bottle for someone very small, tilting it slowly, watching, waiting. I watched Danny Veal, and I understood in the way that children understand things they don't yet have words for, that he had been running out of time in there. That if I had not followed the sound of a dog that wasn't mine past a marker rock, I had promised myself I would not pass this man, would have kept going in the direction his body was currently going, and that direction did not lead somewhere good. I sat on a flat rock at the edge of the clearing, and Virgil worked and the trees stood around us the way old trees do, like witnesses. 40 minutes after we arrived, I heard engines on the logging road. 2 sheriff's cruisers, an ambulance. The paramedics moved to Danny Veal first, which was the right call, and got him onto a stretcher with an efficiency that I watched carefully and found impressive. The way they moved around each other, without talking, each person already knowing where the other was going to be. The way they did 5 things at once, and none of them looked like rushing, even though they clearly were. Marcus Boone refused treatment. He sat on the tailgate of Virgil's truck and drank water, and looked at the trees and said nothing to the deputies who approached him. Curtis Fane and Lee Darrow gave brief statements to a young deputy who wrote things down without looking at them, which I remember thinking was either impressive or not a good sign. Sheriff Slade Pruitt arrived in the second cruiser. He was not a big man, but he had the kind of stillness about him that made a space feel orderly when he occupied it. He had held the job for 11 years and handled it with the kind of competence that doesn't make the news because it mostly consists of things not escalating. He spoke to Marcus Boone at the tailgate for a few minutes. Marcus gave him the outline. They had been riding back from a meeting outside of Dalton. A van cut them off on the back road past the Hendricks property. 6 men with bats and logging chains, outnumbered and ambushed before they could react. Their bikes loaded onto a flatbed, phones smashed, dragged into the trees. Pruitt asked who. Marcus looked at him. They both knew the answer was in that look. Pruitt understood that the answer wasn't going on a recorded statement today. I was sitting on my rock with a juice box a young deputy had produced from somewhere Apple, and I had the straw in and was drinking it and watching everything with the particular attention I gave to things that felt important, but that I didn't yet have a framework for. The woods were quiet again. The birds had come back into the trees above the clearing. A squirrel was complaining about something from somewhere up in the canopy. The sun had gotten higher and was cutting through in long golden columns that moved slowly as the branches moved. I thought it was over. I thought the hard part was done. I had done what I was supposed to do. I had found help. The men were free. The ambulance was here and the police were here, and now the adults would handle the rest of it. And I would go home, and my mother would make me eat something warm and probably cry a little, and my father would look at me for a long time without saying anything. And that would be its own kind of conversation. I finished the juice box, and then a black pickup truck came up the logging road. It stopped 50 yards from the edge of the clearing. It was not a sheriff's vehicle, and it was not an ambulance. It was a crew cab pickup with tinted windows and mud caked in the wheel wells, and it sat there for a moment with the engine running before three men got out. They wore leather vests. Not the same vests, different patches, different colors. They stood by the truck and they looked at the scene, the cruisers, the ambulance, the paramedics working on Danny Veal's stretcher, the freed men. They took it all in without expression, without movement, the way professionals assess a situation before they decide what to do about it. One of them pulled out a phone, made a call, 10 seconds, maybe less. Then all three of them got back in the truck and drove away. No words exchanged with anyone in the clearing. No confrontation. No acknowledgement of the deputies watching them. They came, they looked, they called someone, and they left. The clearing was quiet again. And then Marcus Boone stood up from the tailgate of Virgil's truck so fast that the truck rocked on its suspension. His face was already destroyed, both eyes mostly swollen, his jaw working with visible effort. But what crossed his face in the moment those men got back in their truck was not pain. It was something older than pain, something that had its own temperature. He turned to Slade Pruitt and said something in a low voice that I couldn't hear from where I was sitting. Pruitt's hand went to his radio. Marcus turned away from the deputies and walked to where Virgil was standing at the edge of the clearing and said something else, equally low, equally deliberate. Virgil handed him the phone. Marcus dialed. 3 minutes. That was how long the call lasted. I watched his face while he talked. The expression on it was not angry in the way I understood anger to be the way children get angry, the way adults I knew got angry. This was something that had moved past anger into a place that was very still and very cold and very focused. The kind of expression that belongs to a person who knows exactly what is going to happen next and has accepted it completely. He handed the phone back to Virgil. He sat back down on the tailgate, and he looked out at the tree line and waited. I didn't know what he had said on the phone. I didn't know what the three men in the black truck had meant, or what they had reported back, or who they had reported it to. I didn't know that the next several hours would bring something into Crestfall that the town had never seen and would never see again. I was 8 years old, sitting on a rock in a clearing in the Oregon forest, holding an empty apple juice box, thinking the hard part was over. I was not even close to right. My father sometimes said things about me that he didn't know I heard. He said them to my mother late at night when I was supposed to be asleep, in the quiet voice that adults use when they think the house is theirs again. The walls of our house were thin, and I was a light sleeper. And I had learned young that the conversations that happened after bedtime were often more honest than the ones that happened during the day. One night when I was 6, I heard him tell her about the lawnmower. He had been cutting the back field, the scrubby stretch behind the mechanic shop, that didn't so much grow grass as it grew a general intention towards something green. The mower was old and loud, and he had been watching it and not watching everything else. And at some point, a kitten, one of the barn cat's new litter that had no business being anywhere near that field, had gotten into the path of the deck. He had stopped the mower as fast as he could. But fast was not fast enough, and the kitten was still under there. And what was under there was loud and spinning. He had been reaching for the ignition to shut it down when Ellie walked out of nowhere, bare feet on the stubble, and put both hands under the deck without hesitating and pulled the kitten out. He said he didn't breathe for about 5 seconds after that. He said the machine was still running when she did it. He said, and I heard this clearly through the wall, she didn't think first. She just did it. That is just how she works. There was a pause. He said, I don't know if that is a good thing yet. He said it the way you say something when you have been turning it over for a while and haven't finished yet. My mother said she gets it from you. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yeah, maybe. And then I heard him get up and check the doors like he did every night, front and back. And the house went quiet again. I lay in my bed and thought about what he had said. Not the part about whether it was good or not. Just the description of it. She didn't think first. She just did it. I held that in my head, and turned it around, and I thought, yes, that sounds about right. That is what it feels like from the inside. Like the thinking and the doing are the same motion, like the gap between them is too small to see. I thought about the clearing, about the four men and the chains, and the sound of metal on bark and the grey-blue color of the man on the far left, and the two words spoken by the man with one working eye. I thought about how I had moved toward the problem instead of away from it. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel like a person who had done a remarkable thing. I felt like a person who had been somewhere and seen something and responded to it in the only way that seemed available. Like the other options hadn't quite registered. But lying on my back in the October dark with Pepper warm and snoring against my legs, I thought about the man with the grey-blue skin, about his chest barely moving, about the way Virgil had held the water bottle for him, about the paramedics and the stretcher, and the machinery of emergency care clicking into place around a body that needed it. I thought that was close, and I thought I didn't look away. And I didn't understand yet what that meant, or what it was going to mean, or how it was going to shape the entire rest of my life. But something in me knew that it mattered. Something in me turned it over once and set it down somewhere quiet and permanent, the way you set down something you plan to keep. The house was still. Outside, the forest breathed in the dark. And somewhere in the town of Crestfall, a phone was ringing, and then another. And then more, spreading outward through a network I didn't know existed. Carrying a message I didn't know had been sent, setting in motion something that would roll toward our little town like weather. Like the low sound of engines building in the distance, still too far away to hear. But already moving. Already coming, unstoppable, as anything that travels in numbers that large. I didn't know any of that yet. I fell asleep with my hand on Pepper's side, feeling her breathe. In my left pocket, though, I didn't know it yet, there was a coin waiting for me. The first sound reached Crestfall at 3 in the afternoon. A low rumble, distant and directional, coming from the south, where the county road bent around the base of the ridge before it straightened out into the two-lane that ran through town. The kind of sound that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The kind of sound that made dogs stop what they were doing and lift their heads and hold very still. Pepper heard it first. She was lying on the kitchen floor while my mother made soup, and I sat at the table drawing in my notebook, still in the same clothes from the morning, still with grass stains on my knees from going down in Virgil Gruber's yard. My mother had made me eat half a grilled cheese when we got home, and had looked at my feet for a long time without saying anything about what she was seeing, which was scratches and pine needles and the general evidence of 2 miles run on terrain that called for better footwear. She had cleaned the cuts without making a production of it. She had not asked me many questions. Pepper lifted her head from the floor and looked at the wall that faced south. My mother turned from the stove and looked at the same wall. Then I heard it too. My father had been in the mechanic shop since we got home. That was where Decker Marsh went when he needed to think. Other men had other places, a back porch, a fishing spot, a chair in front of a television. My father had the shop. He would go in there and find something to work on, and the work would run in the background while whatever he needed to process moved through him at its own pace. My mother understood this about him and did not disturb it. But he came in from the shop now. He stood in the kitchen doorway with a shop rag in his hands, wiping grease from his knuckles in the methodical way he did, each finger individually working from the base to the tip. He looked at my mother. She looked at him. Some communication passed between them that used neither words nor expression, just the fluency of two people who have been in the same house long enough to have their own language. He went to the front window. I got up and followed him. The first group came around the curve at the south end of Main Street in a column that stretched the length of the block. 40 motorcycles, maybe more, running, 2 abreast. The sound of them filling the valley completely. The riders wore leather vests. They moved through Crestfall at exactly the speed limit, not a mile over, with the precision of people who had agreed on the pace and held to it without discussion. They were not making trouble. They were not weaving or revving or performing for the people who had come out onto their porches to watch. They were simply arriving. My father stood at the window with the shop rag in his hands and watched them go. His jaw was set in a way I recognized. It was the expression he wore when something was happening that he didn't have control over, and knew he didn't have control over, and was deciding how he felt about that. He said nothing. We watched the last of the first group pass. The sound faded. Then from the south end of town, again the sound built back up. Another column, longer this time. My father turned from the window and looked at me. I looked back at him. He had that expression my mother was better at reading than I was, the one that lived in his eyes rather than anywhere on his face. And what I understood from it was that he was frightened, in the particular way that fathers get frightened, which has nothing to do with their own safety. He said, "Go to your room." I did not go to my room. By 4 o'clock, 500 motorcycles were parked on every available surface within a half-mile of downtown Crestfall. They lined both sides of Main Street from the gas station at the north end to the church parking lot at the south. They filled the lot behind the Legion Hall and the gravel pull-off beside the grain elevator and the wide shoulder of the county road coming in from the east. They were in the diner's parking lot and the post office's lot and arranged in careful diagonal rows along the frontage of the general store where my mother worked 3 days a week, and where she was standing right now, looking out the window at all of them. The riders were not rioting. That was the thing that Slade Pruitt would say later in his careful way when people asked him to describe what it had been like. He would say they weren't rioting, they were organizing. And that, he would say, is a different thing entirely. A riot has a temperature to it, heat and randomness, and the particular noise of people who have lost the thread. What was happening in Crestfall that Saturday afternoon had no heat to it, and was not random, and was not loud in the way chaos is loud. It was quiet in the way that things with a command structure are quiet. Small groups had formed at each of the road intersections leading in and out of town, not blocking them, just present at them. Riders with their arms crossed and their vests on and their eyes on the road watching what came and went. The perimeter of the town was being observed without anyone having said the word perimeter out loud to anyone outside of their own group. The businesses on Main Street had closed at 4 without coordination. Just proprietor after proprietor reading the room and arriving at the same conclusion. The hardware store owner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who hunted elk every November and kept a rifle above his office door, was standing behind his front window with it across his forearms watching the street. He looked like a man who had prepared for many things in his life and had not prepared for this specific thing. Pruitt had called for state police backup at 3:30. They were coming. He had been told to expect 4 units by early evening. It was currently 4:15 and they were not there. And the count outside was climbing towards 600, and Pruitt was standing on the steps of the Crestfall Municipal Building, which was also the post office, and also the place where you paid your water bill, watching his town fill up with leather and chrome, and the low sound of men talking in groups. He had worked a stretch of his early career in the Central Valley of California. He had dealt with club activity before the real kind, not the weekend warrior kind. He knew what a staging ground looked like. He knew what controlled anger looked like. He knew the difference between men who had come to do something specific and men who had come to demonstrate that they could do something specific if they decided to. And he understood that the second category was in many ways more dangerous than the first, because the potential was still undecided. He called Virgil Gruber. Virgil told him what he had already half known since that morning. The peace he had been sitting with since he dialed that second number from his kitchen. He told Pruitt what those leather vests meant, and who those men were, and who Marcus Boone was specifically. And then he told him what the black pickup truck had meant when it came up the logging road and its 3 occupants had stood there and looked and made a phone call. Pruitt hung up and stood on the steps of the municipal building for a moment. Then he went back to watching the road and waiting for something to tell him which way this was going to go. Here is what Slade Pruitt did not know yet, and what I would not understand until years later when I was old enough to understand how the world I had walked into that morning actually worked. Marcus Boone was not simply a member of a motorcycle club. He was the chapter president, the elected head of a Hells Angel chapter that covered 4 counties in southern Oregon, a chapter that had been his to run for 6 years, that had its own economy and its own laws and its own internal structure, that operated completely outside of anything Slade Pruitt or any other law enforcement official in the state had jurisdiction over. Danny Veal, the man with the gray-blue skin, the man whose chest had barely been moving when I found him, was not simply another rider. He was the sergeant-at-arms, the enforcer, the man responsible for the chapter's internal discipline and external security, which meant he was the man who was supposed to prevent exactly what had happened to him from happening. Curtis Fain and Lee Darrow had been patched members for over a decade each. They were not peripheral figures. They were the experienced core of the chapter's operational membership. The 4 men chained to that tree had not been chosen at random. The Iron Reapers, the club whose vest patches had been on the 3 men in the black pickup truck, had not stumbled into an opportunistic attack. They had spent months watching, identifying patterns, knowing who rode where and when. They had waited for a specific window a night when all 4 of these specific men would be riding back together from a meeting on a back road without support. They had cut off the road with a van. 6 men with baseball bats and logging chains and the organizational commitment to overwhelm 4 people before those 4 people could react. They had taken the bikes because bikes were worth money, and also because taking a man's bike is a specific kind of insult in that world, a statement about his status and his power, and whether either of those things was going to be allowed to continue. The drug corridor that ran through 3 counties, the one that both clubs claimed some version of territorial rights over, had been a source of escalating conflict for the better part of a year. Both sides had been pushing at the edges of the other's space, small provocations, the kind that build up like pressure in a system until something gives. What the Iron Reapers had done to Marcus Boone and his men in those woods was not an escalation. It was a declaration. It was calculated and specific and professionally executed, and it was intended to send a message that would be understood clearly by everyone in that world who received it. The leadership of your chapter is vulnerable. We can reach them. Here is the proof. What they had not calculated, what no one in either club's planning conversations had accounted for, was an 8-year-old girl in a flannel shirt who had followed the sound of a dog she didn't own past a marker rock she had promised herself not to cross. My father came in from the front window at around 4:30 and sat down at the kitchen table across from me. My mother stood at the counter with her arms crossed and looked at both of us. Decker said, "Ellie, tell me exactly what happened. From the beginning." So I told him. The way I told things, which was in order and without decoration, just the events in the sequence they had occurred. The dog barking, the marker rock, the sound of metal on wood, the clearing, the 4 men, the chains and the padlocks and the man who opened one eye, the conversation, the running, Virgil's yard, the bolt cutters and the blankets and the man on the far left who couldn't hold the water bottle, the black pickup truck. When I finished, my father was quiet for a moment. He put the shop rag on the table and looked at it. He said, "You did the right thing." He said it flatly without emphasis, which was how he said things he meant most. If my father added warmth to a statement, it meant he was aware he was saying it. If he said something flat and plain like that with no performance around it, it meant the statement had come out before he had time to shape it. It was just true, and he said it. My mother made a sound in the back of her throat that was not quite a word. Then the phone rang. It was Slade Pruitt. My father listened for about 30 seconds. His face did not change. He said yes twice and thank you once, and then he hung up and stood there with his hand still on the receiver. He said, "There is a man in town who wants to meet Ellie." My mother said, "Absolutely not." My father said, "Nora." She said it again. "Absolutely not. These are not people she should be anywhere near. These are not people any of us should be anywhere near." My father said, I know. He said it the way he said things when he knew something was more complicated than a straight line from one point to another. Not arguing, not agreeing, just acknowledging that the terrain between here and any decision was not flat. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, let me go outside. He went out through the back door and stood in the yard where the tree line began and stayed there for a while. I watched him through the kitchen window. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his work jeans and looked at the trees, the way he did when he needed to think and needed to do it without walls around him. When he came back in, my mother was at the kitchen table, and her arms were no longer crossed, which meant something had shifted in her, to some internal calculation running its course. She said, let me talk to Ellie. My father went back to his window. My mother sat across from me where he had been sitting. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. She had a way of doing that, not studying you exactly, more like making sure she was actually seeing you before she said something that mattered. She said, Ellie, there are people in town who want to say thank you for what you did today, for finding those men and getting help. I said the ones from the tree. She said their friends. I said, how many friends? She paused. A lot, she said. Honey, a lot. I thought about the sound of the engines that had been coming through the walls of the house for the past 2 hours. The sound that had been building and building, layering on itself the way a storm builds on the horizon. I said, okay. My mother closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she looked like she had made peace with something she hadn't chosen. She said, let's get your shoes. We drove into Crestfall in my father's truck, all three of us, my father behind the wheel, and my mother in the passenger seat, and me in the back. My father's jaw was doing the thing it did. My mother was looking straight ahead through the windshield. Nobody was talking. When we turned onto the south end of Main Street, I pressed my face against the window. The motorcycles were lined up on both sides of the road as far as I could see, which from the back window of a pickup truck was considerable. The riders stood or sat between them in ones and twos and small groups. Some of them watched the truck pass. Most of them did not react, which in a way was more striking than if they had, because it meant their attention was organized around something other than us, something that had a center I couldn't see yet from where I was sitting. Pruitt's cruiser was parked in front of the diner. He was standing on the sidewalk when we pulled in, and he came to my father's window and said something brief and quiet. My father nodded once. We got out. The diner was a narrow building with a counter along one wall and 6 booths along the other, and a specials board behind the register that had not been fully updated since September. It smelled like coffee and the particular warm grease smell of a short-order kitchen that has been in continuous operation for a long time. Raymond Stokes was sitting in the back booth. I noticed him the way you notice things that are different from their surroundings. Not because he was loud or large, though he was tall and lean, the kind of man who had shed any softness a long time ago, and what remained was functional. The vest he wore was so covered in patches and pins and insignia that it was hard to see the leather underneath it. His hair was silver, and he wore it short, and his face had the quality of a landscape that has been through a lot of weather and arrived at something permanent. He was not doing anything when we walked in. He was sitting with both hands around a coffee cup, and he was waiting. That was all. But there was something about the quality of his waiting that was different from ordinary waiting. It had weight to it. It had the quality of a man who was accustomed to things happening on his timeline and had temporarily chosen to suspend that. He stood when he saw me. The room went still. I don't know how to describe what that stillness felt like, except to say that it was not uncomfortable. It was the stillness of something landing correctly, a thing falling into place that had been in motion for a while. Stokes was over 6 feet tall. I was 8 years old and small for it. The distance between us when we met in the middle of that diner felt like the distance between two completely different scales of the same world. He did not crouch down to my level. He did not use a soft voice or a simplified version of what he meant to say. He pulled out the chair across from him and said, "Have a seat, Ellie." I sat down. He sat across from me. My parents stood at the end of the table. Pruitt stood near the door. The counter waitress had disappeared into the kitchen and was making herself very busy back there. Stokes looked at me for a moment, not evaluating, just looking the way you look at something you have been told about and are now seeing for yourself, checking whether the description matches the reality. Then he said, "Do you know who I am?" I shook my head. He said, "My name is Raymond Stokes. The men you found today are part of my organization. The big one, Marcus, he is the one who runs things in this part of the state. And the one they took to the hospital, Danny, he would not have survived another 2 hours in those woods. The doctors told us that tonight. I listened to this. He said, I want you to understand something. You didn't just find 4 hurt men and get them some help. You saved Danny Veal's life. At 8 years old, with no shoes on, with no phone, running 2 miles through the woods, you saved his life." I thought about Danny Veal's gray-blue skin and his chest barely moving, and the way he couldn't hold the water bottle. I said, "Are they going to be okay?" "All 4 of them." Stokes looked at me and something crossed his face that I did not have the vocabulary for at 8 years old, but that I would think about later, much later, and understand to be the expression of a man who was seeing something that surprised him in a way very few things still could. He said, "Yes, because of you, they are going to be okay." Then he reached into the inside pocket of his vest and set something on the table between us. It was a coin, bronze old one, smooth on one side from decades of handling. On the other side was an insignia I didn't recognize, detailed and specific, the kind of image that had meaning inside a particular world that I was standing at the edge of. "You know what this is," he said. I shook my head. "This is a marker," he said. "It means you are under our protection. Anywhere, anytime anyone wearing our patch sees this coin, they know your family. They know this coin exists and what it means. You carry this and you are covered. Your family is covered." He slid it across the table to me. I picked it up, one side smooth and warm from his pocket, the other side with the insignia raised against my thumb. I turned it over once, set it down, looked at him, and said, "Are they going to be okay?" "All 4 of them." There was a pause in the booth. My mother made a small sound behind me. Stokes said, "Yes. I told you yes." I said I just wanted to make sure I heard it right. He looked at me for another moment. Then he did something I had not seen his face do yet. He almost smiled. It was small and controlled, and it didn't last long, but it was real. I could tell it was real the way you can tell the difference between a thing being performed and a thing actually happening. He said, "Yeah, kid, you heard it right." Then he turned to Slade Pruitt. The warmth left his face completely. What replaced it was different in quality from anything I had seen in there before. It was not anger. It was something that had moved past anger a while ago and settled into something colder and more deliberate. The kind of cold that belongs to a person who has already decided what the outcome is going to be and is now simply managing the path between here and there. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a piece of paper folded twice. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Pruitt, the way he had slid the coin toward me, a deliberate and final motion. "Names," he said, "addresses. The 3 Iron Reapers who were at the scene today, and 4 more who planned the operation. That is everything your department needs to make 7 arrests." Pruitt picked up the paper and unfolded it and looked at it. He looked at it for longer than it should have taken to read it, which meant he was thinking, not reading. He said, "How did you get this?" Stokes said, "It doesn't matter how I got it. What matters is that I am giving it to you instead of handling it myself. You understand what that means." Pruitt looked up from the paper. The 2 men looked at each other across the table with me sitting between them. Pruitt understood. I could see him understanding it. The weight of what was being placed on this table, the specific weight of it. The fact that the piece of paper was here and not somewhere else, that it was being handed to law enforcement and not being acted on outside of law enforcement. That choice had a meaning that Pruitt was absorbing in real time. Stokes said the girl did right by our brothers, so we will do right by your laws. He paused. This time, he said. He said this time twice. The second time was quieter than the first, not louder, not more emphatic. Just said again so that it could settle where it needed to settle. Pruitt heard it both times. You could see him hearing both of them, filing them in the correct place. Stokes stood up from the booth. He was finished. Everything that needed to happen in this diner had happened, and he was finished, and his body communicated that without drama. He dropped a $5 bill on the table next to the coffee cup. He looked at my parents. He said to my father, "You raised a daughter worth raising." My father looked at him for a long moment. Then he put out his hand. I watched my father's face while they shook. He did not want to do it. Every line of him said he did not want to do it. He was a man who had kept his family away from this world. By keeping his family away from this world, by living at the end of a gravel road and running a one-bay shop, and not asking questions about the things that moved through the county around him. He had earned that distance. It had cost him something to earn it, and he had paid that cost willingly. And now he was standing in the Crestfall Diner, shaking hands with the regional president of the Hells Angels, because his 8-year-old daughter had followed a dog's bark past a marker rock and changed the shape of a Saturday. He shook the hand, because I was watching, and because whatever else these men were, whatever world they moved in and whatever rules governed that world, they had looked at what his daughter had done and they had honored it. They had come 2,000 strong to honor it. And Decker Marsh, who showed love through action and not language, who checked the locks every night and drove in the dark without being asked and fixed things before being told they were broken, understood that an act like that had a weight that you acknowledged even when you didn't choose it. He shook the hand. Stokes walked out of the diner. Through the window, I watched him get into the black SUV. The SUV pulled out of the lot and moved north on Main Street. The riders it passed turned to watch it go, and something in the way they watched it, in the small movements and the adjustments that rippled through the groups standing along the road, told me that the presence of that vehicle had been the thing holding a particular question open. And now that it was moving, and the question had been answered, whatever came next could begin. My father drove us home at 6:30. I sat in the back seat with the coin in my hand, one thumb on the smooth side, one on the rough. The engine of our truck was loud in the way that old trucks are loud, and the cab smelled like motor oil and my father's work shirts and faintly like the soup my mother had been making when this day arrived. Nobody talked on the way home. When we got there, my father sat in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine. Just sat with his hands on the wheel and looked at the tree line where the forest started behind the house. The same tree line I had walked into that morning with Pepper at my side, and a Bentrim bike's worth of confidence and no particular plan beyond following a sound I wanted to find the source of. He got out of the truck. He went inside without looking at either of us, which was not cold, just Decker, just the way he processed things that were too large for the kitchen. My mother put her hand on my shoulder in the back seat and held it there for a moment. She said, "You did a good thing today, Ellie." I looked out the window at the fading light through the trees. I said, "I know." She squeezed my shoulder once and then let go. We went inside. The soup was still on the stove, cooled now, and my mother heated it up without being asked and put a bowl in front of me, and I ate it. And Pepper sat next to my chair and put her head on my knee the way she did when she could tell something big had happened, and the kitchen was warm and the light was yellow, and outside the Oregon dark was settling down over the ridge and the trees. I could still hear them, faintly. The sound of engines idling somewhere in the direction of town, the low collective hum of 2,000 machines keeping themselves ready. I held the coin under the table where my mother couldn't see it. Outside, the sound of Crestfall holding its breath. At 10 o'clock that night, 2,000 engines started at once. I was in my bed when it happened, not asleep, just lying there in the dark with Pepper against my legs and the coin on my nightstand, where I could see it if enough light came through the curtains. I had been lying there for a while, not thinking exactly, more like letting the day move through me in the way that very large things move through you when you are young and don't yet have the frameworks to organize them. You just lie still and let them pass and trust that your brain will do something useful with them eventually. And then the sound came. It started as a vibration more than a sound. Something that came up through the mattress and the floor and the foundation of the house before it arrived as anything the ear could identify. Then it became sound. Then it became the most sound I had ever heard in one place at one time. A wave of it rolling through the valley and hitting the ridge and coming back and then hitting it again, layering on itself 2,000 individual engines, combining into something that was no longer a collection of separate things, but a single enormous presence. The windows in my room trembled. Pepper lifted her head. I got up. My father was already on the front porch when I got outside. He was standing at the top of the steps with his hands in the pockets of his work jeans looking south toward town. My mother came out behind me and stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself against the colt. The sound was moving. It had direction and momentum. A tide going out, pulling away from Crestfall in the way that water pulls away from a shore before it is simply gone. The individual engines were still indistinguishable from one another, still a single thing. But the single thing was in motion now, and the motion was away, and I could feel that in my chest, the way you feel a change in pressure. I walked down the porch steps and across the dead grass of the front yard to the edge of the gravel and stood there. Pepper came and sat next to my left foot the way she did. The sound rolled south and then east, splitting along the county road, dispersing into the dark along every road that led away from Crestfall, and each direction it traveled. The sound thinned a little more, individual threads of it separating from the main body, until they were too faint to follow. And then they were gone, and the one before them was gone, and the one before that, and the valley was finding its way back to the sound it made when it was only itself. I stood there until the last engine faded. It took longer than you would think. The hills held the sound after the source of it had gone, turning it over and passing it back and forth between them before finally letting it go. And then there was just the night and the trees and the particular silence that follows something enormous, which is not the same as ordinary silence, because it has the shape of what just left it pressed into it. The way a bed holds the shape of a person after they get up. My father had come down off the porch. He was standing a few feet to my left. We stood there together in the dark and the quiet for a while without talking. That was a thing we could do, my father and I, stand near each other in silence and have it mean something. The silence itself was a kind of language between us, and I had grown up fluent in it. After a while, he put his hand on top of my head briefly, just resting it there for a moment. The way you rest your hand on something solid to confirm it is still there. Then he took it away and went back inside. I stayed a little longer. I looked at the ridgeline against the sky, the dark mass of it with the stars beginning to appear above it now that the cloud cover from the afternoon had thinned. Somewhere past that ridge was a clearing with a Douglas fir at the center of it, and chain links on the ground, and the ghost of something that had happened and been changed, and would not go back to being what it was before. I went back inside. On my nightstand, the coin sat where I had left it. I picked it up and held it in my palm, and then set it back down and got into bed. And Pepper climbed up after me, and my mother came in and pulled the blanket up and kissed my forehead and turned off the light. And I lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe and the forest breathe and the valley settling back into itself. I was asleep before I knew I was falling. The arrests happened in 48 hours. 7 of them across 2 counties, executed with the kind of efficiency that comes from having precise information about exactly where people are and exactly what they did. Slade Pruitt coordinated with the county sheriff's office and the state police, and the piece of paper that Raymond Stokes had slid across a diner table became the operational foundation of what was, by the standards of rural Southern Oregon law enforcement, a significant organized crime operation. The charges were federal in scope: kidnapping, aggravated assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, grand theft of property valued in excess of $50,000. The stolen motorcycles alone covered that threshold several times over. 3 of the 7 men arrested had been present at the clearing when the black pickup came up the logging road. The other 4 had planned the operation from a distance, coordinated the vehicles, arranged the flatbed that carried 4 Hells Angels motorcycles to a warehouse in a county 2 over, where they were found stripped down to their frames, but intact enough, the investigators said, to be rebuilt. The trial took 4 months. Slade Pruitt testified. Virgil Gruber testified. The paramedics testified. Marcus Boone testified briefly, and without embellishment, in a pressed button-down shirt that looked uncomfortable on him, his wrists healed by then but still marked by what had happened to them. He answered the questions put to him, and did not answer the ones not put to him. And he looked at the jury the way a man looks at something he has decided to trust for practical rather than philosophical reasons. All 7 were convicted. The motorcycles were recovered and returned. The rebuilding process took months. Marcus Boone finished his own in his garage over the winter, piece by piece, which was his choice and his right, and his way of reclaiming something that had been taken. Danny Veal spent 11 days in the hospital. 2 cracked ribs, one of which had fractured in a way that caused a partial collapse of his left lung, severe dehydration, the early stages of hypothermia, which in a man his size and physical condition had progressed more slowly than it might have in someone less resilient, but had been progressing steadily for the hours he had been in those woods, and would have continued progressing. The attending physician, a direct woman named Dr. Paulson, who did not soften her assessments, told Danny's family plainly that another 2 to 3 hours of exposure at October temperatures in those woods would have been sufficient to tip the balance. His organs were already beginning to respond to the cold in ways that would have become irreversible. He walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet 11 days after he was carried in. He did not look back at the building when he left. Marcus Boone sent a letter to our house 3 weeks after the arrests. It arrived in a plain envelope, handwritten address, no return label. My mother found it in the mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon and brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. She read it standing at the table. I was not in the room, but I heard her come in, and then I heard a long silence that had a different quality from ordinary silence. And then I heard her open the kitchen cabinet above the counter. I came to the kitchen doorway. She was standing at the open cabinet with her back to me, and she was using a pushpin to fix the letter to the inside face of the cabinet door, the part that faces you when the cabinet is open, the part you see every morning when you reach for a coffee cup. She did not know I was watching. She smoothed the letter flat with the back of her hand once deliberately, then closed the cabinet. She stood there for a moment with her hand still on the cabinet door. Then she turned around and saw me in the doorway. We looked at each other. She said, "Good morning, sweetheart," even though it was afternoon. I said, "Good morning." She went to the stove. I never asked what the letter said. She never told me. My father never mentioned it, not once, not in any of the years that followed. But I noticed that the cabinet was never reorganized in a way that would require moving what was pinned to its inside face. I noticed that when my mother opened it each morning for her coffee cup, there was a pause, brief and consistent, a moment of stillness before she reached in. Some things are private not because they are shameful, but because the weight of them belongs to the person carrying it and to no one else. I understood that even at 8, I left it alone. I left it alone for 24 years. Crestfall went back to being Crestfall. This happened gradually, the way towns reabsorb unusual events, not by forgetting them, but by building the ordinary back up around them, Until the ordinary is what you see when you look at the town from the outside, and the event is what you see when you know where to look. The hardware store reopened. The diner never closed. Technically just sent everyone home early that Saturday and opened again Sunday morning at 6 as if nothing had happened, which was either resilience or denial, and was probably both. People talked about it in the way that people in small towns talk about things that don't have a comfortable category. Inside conversations at the gas station and over back fences, and in the specific coded language of people who are processing something together without agreeing to process it together. Some of them were angry. They had lived in Crestfall their whole lives. And the idea that 2,000 strangers could occupy their town for an afternoon without invitation and without consequence sat poorly with them. And that anger was not unreasonable. Some were relieved. The thing had ended without broken windows or hurt civilians or the specific brand of chaos that could have arrived with that many people in that smaller space. Most were simply confused in the way that people are confused when they encounter a world operating by rules they were never shown. But they agreed on one thing, all of them. Even the angry ones. Even the ones who called Pruitt at the station to complain about being held hostage in their own town. Even Gerald Fitch, who had stood behind his window with the rifle, and who would talk about that Saturday for the rest of his life, they all said the same thing when the conversation got down to its foundation. The Marsh girl did the right thing. Not they should have called somebody else or she should have stayed out of it. Or why was an 8-year-old out in those woods alone? Those conversations existed too, but they were not the central conversation. The central conversation was simpler, and it was the same everywhere it happened. She found men who needed help. She got them help. She did it without hesitating. She was 8 years old, and she did not freeze. Mrs. Hale asked me about my weekend on Monday morning the way she always asked. I said I found some people who needed help. She waited the way teachers wait for the continuation of an answer. I did not provide one. She wrote, "Pleasant" on my next progress report, same as she always did, same word in the same place. I saw it when my mother signed it and handed it back to me for the return envelope. I put it in the envelope. But something had shifted in me that I couldn't have named at 8, and that I would spend years finding the right words for. It wasn't confidence in the showy sense, the kind that announces itself. It was something quieter and more structural, a piece of the floor that had been uncertain and was now solid. I had been somewhere real. I had been tested by something that didn't soften itself for me because of my age, and I had not looked away, and I had not frozen, and I had done the thing that needed doing without stopping to calculate whether I was qualified to do it. I still sat in the back of the class. I still drew birds in the margins of my worksheets. I was still by any external measurement pleasant. But something underneath that had changed its shape and was not going to change back. Every year on the last Saturday of October, they came through Crestfall. Not 2,000, nothing like that. 20 or 30, sometimes fewer, a small column moving through town at exactly the speed limit, turning into the lot of the general store where my mother worked, going inside and buying things. Coffee, canned goods, whatever was on the shelves. They paid without negotiating. They nodded at whoever was behind the counter. They filed back out to their bikes and rode south the way they had come. No ceremony, no announcement, no explanation for anyone who happened to be watching and didn't know the context. Just the acknowledgement repeated annually that something had happened here, and that a debt existed, and that the debt was being honored in the only quiet way available to people who did not traffic in quiet. My mother always worked the counter herself on those Saturdays. She always had the store stocked well. She always knew they were coming, and she never said so out loud to anyone. My father always found something to do in the shop that kept him inside. I watched from the window of the general store twice before I was old enough to understand fully what I was watching. And then I was old enough and I watched it differently. And then I went away to school and then to training. And the tradition continued without my being there to see it. And my mother would mention it briefly on the phone in October. Just a line they came through again on Saturday. And I would say, I know. And she would say, I know, you know. And we would move on to other things, and the line would stay between us. Unelaborated, understood. I was 16 when Danny Veal came back to Crestfall. It was a Tuesday in late September, the specific kind of September day that Oregon does, where the light is gold and horizontal, and the air is cold enough to smell like something is ending, but warm enough to stand in without a jacket if you stay in the sun. I was home from school and sitting on the front porch steps doing homework that I was not actually doing, mostly looking at the tree line the way I sometimes did, the way the ridge was visible above it when the light was right. I heard a motorcycle on the gravel road. Not a group, just one. It came around the last bend and pulled into the driveway and stopped, and the engine cut and the quiet came back. The motorcycle was a Harley black and chrome, and it was clean in the way that a thing is clean when the person who owns it respects it in a specific and personal way. Not just washed, but tended to each component, understood and cared for individually. The man who got off it was not the man I had found in the clearing 8 years earlier. He was the same person. I understood that immediately, the way you understand a continuity, even when the evidence of time is significant. But the version of Danny Veal standing in my driveway was different from the version I had found chained to a tree with grey-blue skin and a chest barely moving. He was heavier in a healthy way, the weight of a man who had rebuilt something that had been depleted. His face had healed into different terrain than the one he had before the broken angles fused into something that looked permanent and considered. He stood with his weight balanced, both feet on the ground, the posture of a man who was present in a body that was working. He saw me on the steps and he stopped. For a moment, neither of us moved. He said, I wasn't sure you would still be here. I said, I live here. He almost smiled. He said, I know. I meant I wasn't sure I would catch you home. He walked to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. He looked up at me and I looked down at him. And there was the 8 years between us present in the space like a third thing. He said, I don't know if you remember me. I said you were the one who wasn't moving. He nodded slowly. Once, just once, the way people nod when they are receiving something rather than agreeing with something. He said, that is right. That is exactly right. He looked out at the tree line. The same trees, the same ridge, the same forest that had been there 8 years ago and would be there for another 100. The Douglas firs that surrounded the marsh property had been old when my grandparents built the house. They would be old when whoever came after me was gone. He said, I have been sober 3 years. He said it simply, without preface or decoration, the way you say a thing that is important enough not to need framing. He said, I have a daughter. She is 2. Her name is June, which was my mother's name. He looked back at me. He said, I came here to tell you something that I have been trying to figure out how to say for a while. And I don't think there is a good way to say it. I think it just has to be said plain. I waited. He said, every day I have everything that comes after that morning in those woods. My daughter, 3 years of being someone worth being. My mother, getting to meet her grandchild before she got sick, all of it. Every single piece of it started with you standing in that clearing, holding a stick and deciding not to run. The yard was quiet. A woodpecker was working at something in the high branches to the north. The light was doing the thing it does in September, lying down across the top of the grass at a long angle, making everything it touched look briefly like the best version of itself. I didn't know what to say. I said what felt honest. I said, I am glad you are okay. He looked at me for a moment. Then he laughed. It came up from somewhere deep in his chest, full and unguarded, and completely without self-consciousness. And it was so entirely different from the sound of a man in a clearing who could barely breathe, that it took me a second to locate it correctly, to match it to the person standing in front of me, and not to the version I had been carrying around for 8 years. He said, yeah, me too, kid, me too. He went back to his motorcycle. He swung onto it and settled and put the key in and looked back at me once from the seat. He gave me a nod, the particular kind that doesn't need words because the words have already been said. And what is left is just the acknowledgement that they landed. He started the engine. He rode back down the gravel road and around the bend, and the sound moved south through the trees and thinned and was gone. I sat on the steps for a long time after that. The afternoon light moved across the yard the way it always did. Pepper, older now, came out through the screen door and found her spot next to my feet and put her head down on the wood. The ridge was visible above the tree line. The clearing was somewhere behind it, past the marker rock down the western slope, still there, the way places stay after the things that happened in them are finished. I thought about what he had said. Every day I have. I turned that over and held it and set it down and picked it up again, the way you do with things that are simple on the surface and complicated underneath, things that take a while to understand completely, even when you understand them immediately. My mother came out onto the porch a few minutes later. She had seen the motorcycle from the kitchen window. She sat down next to me on the steps and didn't ask anything. Just sat there the way she did when she understood that sitting there was the thing that was needed. After a while she said, "That was him, wasn't it?" I said yes. She was quiet for another moment. She said, "Good." Just that. Just good. In the tone of someone who has been waiting for a thing to resolve itself and has just seen it do so. We sat on the porch until the light changed and the cold came in off the ridge, and then we went inside and she made dinner, and my father came in from the shop, and we ate together at the kitchen table under the yellow light, and nobody talked much. And that was fine, because in our family, silence had never been emptiness. It had always been its own kind of fullness. And that evening, it was full of something I didn't have a name for yet, but that felt like it was in the right place. I became a paramedic. I know how that sounds, like a clean line drawn between cause and effect. Like the story assembled itself into a lesson with a moral at the end. It wasn't quite like that. It wasn't that I woke up after the clearing and decided. It was more gradual than that, more interior. A long, slow understanding of what I was built for, that had been developing its whole life, and that one October morning had simply confirmed rather than created. I had always been the kind of person who moved toward problems, who watched things carefully, and responded before others had finished deciding whether to respond, who did not find emergency situations paralyzing in the way that most people did. These were not choices, they were architecture. The clearing didn't build that architecture. It revealed it to me the way certain kinds of weather reveal the shape of a landscape that was always there beneath whatever was growing on the surface. I went to community college in Eugene and then to the EMT program at the Regional Training Center, and I passed everything on the first attempt and received my certification at 21 years old on a Thursday afternoon in a room full of other people who had done the same. And I drove home to Crestfall and ate dinner with my parents. And my mother cried briefly and quietly into her napkin. And my father said, "Well done," in the flat, undecorated way that meant he meant it completely. And we did not make a big occasion of it, because in our family the doing of a thing was the occasion, and the dinner was just dinner. I started at the station in Millbrook, 2 towns east of Crestfall, 6 weeks later. My first partner was a man named Harmon, who had been doing the job for 18 years, and who communicated primarily in silence and in action, and who I got along with immediately for reasons that will probably be obvious by now. He told me in my first week that this job would teach me things about people and about the distance between alive and not alive that nothing else could teach, and that the lesson came whether you wanted it or not, so I might as well want it. I wanted it. My colleagues said things about me over the years the way colleagues observe each other in the compressed intimacy of shared work. They said I was calm, that nothing seemed to rattle me, that I moved through emergencies with a steadiness that wasn't learned, or if it was learned, had been learned somewhere so early that it was indistinguishable from nature. One of them, a woman named Terry, who had been at the station for 12 years when I arrived, said to me once over coffee between calls that it seemed like I had already seen the worst thing I was ever going to see, and everything after that was just work. I thought about that. I thought she was probably right, and also that it was more complicated than that, and that the complicated version was not something I was going to explain over a station coffee. Some things you carry in a way that is private, not because they are secret, but because they belong to you in a specific way that does not translate easily into words for other people, and trying to translate them costs something that is not worth the price. I never told anyone at work about the coin. It was not a secret. It was private. There is a difference between those two things, and I had understood the difference since I was 8 years old, standing in a kitchen doorway watching my mother smooth a letter flat against the inside of a cabinet door. The coin went in my left pocket at the start of every shift. Same motion, same pocket, same place. Keys in my right, radio on my hip, coin in my left. The ritual was so embedded that I did it without thinking. The way you do the things that are truly yours, without decision, without ceremony, without needing to remind yourself why. Some shifts I would reach into my pocket between calls and find it with my fingers without taking it out. Just hold it through the fabric for a moment and let it be what it was. A reminder. Not of the chains or the blood or the grey-blue color of a man nearly gone. Not of 2,000 engines shaking the windows of our house. Not of Raymond Stokes in a diner booth, or the coin sliding across a formica table, or the weight of my father's hand on my head in the dark. A reminder of the moment itself, the moment I stood at the edge of a clearing in the Oregon forest on an October morning, and saw something that I could have turned away from, and did not. The moment when the option of walking backward up the slope and going home and saying nothing presented itself clearly, and I looked at it and set it aside and stepped forward into the clearing instead. That moment, which was not heroic in any way I recognized from the outside, which was not brave in the way that word gets used for people who make large, deliberate choices in full awareness of the risk. It was just a movement, just a step, just the gap between standing still and moving closing to nothing, because closing to nothing was the only thing that made sense. She didn't think first, she just did it. I had heard my father say that about me when I was 6 years old, and I had held it all this time, not because it was praise, not because it was a warning, but because it was true. And the truest things about ourselves are the ones worth keeping. The ones that stay unchanged through all the years and all the circumstances that try to complicate them. I am 32 years old. I am sitting in the cab of my ambulance on a Tuesday in October, on a shift that has been quiet in the particular waiting way that shifts get quiet before they stop being quiet. The coffee in my cup went cold 40 minutes ago, and I have not done anything about it. The scanner is making its low background noise. Outside the window, the light is doing what October light does in Oregon, lying down long and golden across everything, making ordinary things look briefly like themselves at their best. Pepper has been gone for 10 years. I still reach for her sometimes when I'm sitting somewhere quiet and expecting to find her next to my foot. And then I remember, and the remembering is its own small thing. Not painful exactly. More like the particular weight of love that has nowhere current to go and so sits with you quietly instead. My parents are older. My mother still works the counter at the general store on Tuesdays. My father's shop is still behind the house, still one bay, still smelling of oil and metal and the specific kind of work that keeps things running. He moves slower now, but his hands are still the same hands, still knowing, still patient with broken things. Crestfall is still Crestfall. Every last Saturday of October, a small group of motorcycles comes through town. My hand is in my left pocket. I'm not looking at the coin. I don't need to look at it. I can read it by feel after 24 years, every detail of the insignia on one side, the worn smoothness of the other. I know it the way you know the things you have carried long enough, that they become part of the weight you are used to the weight. You would notice the absence of before you noticed anything else. I think about Danny Veal sometimes. About June, who would be 18, now the same age I was getting close to when her father rode up my gravel driveway on a Tuesday in September to say a thing that needed to be said plain. I think about whether she knows the story, whether he told her, whether she knows that her name is connected at some remove to an October morning, and a clearing and a girl who did not look away. It doesn't matter whether she knows. The life she has is the same life either way. But I think about it sometimes. I think about Marcus Boone sitting on the tailgate of Virgil Gruber's truck, trying to make his hands work opening and closing his fist against the damage done to his wrists, methodical and patient, the work of reclaiming what belonged to him, one small motion at a time. I think about my mother at the kitchen cabinet in the morning, her hand on the door for a moment before she reaches in the pause that has been there for 24 years and will be there for however many more she has, brief and consistent and entirely her own. I think about my father in the dark front yard with his hand resting on top of my head briefly, just long enough to confirm something before he took it away and went back inside to check the locks. The way he always did front and back, and the house went quiet. I think about Mrs. Hale writing pleasant on a progress report, and how that word sat next to everything I actually was, and how the gap between the word and the reality was nobody's fault. Just the limitation of a word trying to do a job that words are not quite built, for trying to name a whole person with a single adjective, and landing somewhere true but incomplete, the way single words usually do when they are aimed at anything that matters. I think about the clearing. I think about standing at its edge at 8 years old with pine needles working their way through the soles of my sneakers, and my heart doing what hearts do when they are asked to make a decision. The rest of you hasn't finished making yet. I think about stepping in. That is the thing I carry. Not the coin, though. The coin is in my pocket. Not the memory of the men or the chains, or the sound of 2,000 engines, or the way a piece of paper slid across a diner table changed what happened next. Those are the circumstances. The circumstances are not the thing. The thing is the step. The decision that was not quite a decision that happened in the space too small and too fast for decision-making. That was just the body doing what it was built to do, when the gap between standing still and moving forward closed to nothing. The thing that my father had named before I understood what it meant when I was 6 years old pulling a kitten out from under a running mower, when he lay awake and turned it over, and wasn't sure yet whether it was a gift or a danger, or both. Which it was, which it always is, which is fine. I have taken that step 10,000 times since then. In burning buildings, in wrecked cars, in houses where something has gone terribly wrong, and what is needed is a person who moves toward it instead of away from it. I have taken it in the dark and in the cold, and in the specific chaos that arrives when the ordinary structure of a day collapses, and what is left is just neat stripped of everything else and the question of who is going to answer it. I have always answered it, not because of bravery, not because of the clearing or the coin or the particular series of events that shaped an October Saturday 24 years ago, because of what I am, because of what was in me before any of it happened. The thing that was there when I was 6 years old and a kitten was under a running mower, and the gap between doing and not doing closed before I had time to find it. The scanner makes its noise. The October light moves across the parking lot outside the ambulance window, doing what it does, making everything briefly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when the light hits them from the side and brings out whatever depth they have been holding all along. My hand finds the coin through the fabric of my pocket, one side smooth, one side rough. Somewhere back in Crestfall, the last Saturday of the month is coming. A small group of motorcycles will come through town the way they have come through town every October for 24 years. They will stop at my mother's store. They will buy things and nod and leave and say nothing that needs to be said because the thing has been said every October for 24 years now without words, and will continue to be said that way for as long as there is someone on each side of the exchange who knows what it means. My mother will work the counter herself. My father will find something to do in the shop. And somewhere on a highway in southern Oregon, a group of riders will move through the October light toward a small town at the end of a gravel road, honoring a debt that most of the world will never know exists, in the only language available to people for whom silence has always been sufficient. I take my hand out of my pocket. I pick up the cold coffee. I look out the window at the light on the ordinary world, and I wait for the next call.